Thank you so much, Professor Raven. I didn't know that us and the animals which we consume are 95% of mammals. Did I understand you correctly? Yeah, us and.
Yep.
I didn't know that. And I'm relating to agriculture, so thank you for all what you said. Colleagues, your questions and comments on this lecture on the health of the planet and lack thereof. Peter, is there silence? Let me ask you one question. Yeah. Could you briefly comment on the state of affairs of botanical gardens globally under these circumstances? Seed banks, in situ conservation, so the action to deal with some of these problems, are we doing okay, and don't all these mechanisms need to be adjusted, expanded under climate change?
Yes. We estimate there are about 470,000 kinds of plants. We use about 103 of them for 90% of our food, 3 of them for 60% of our food, but thousands of them been used for our food in the past. And for 2/3 of the people in the world, plants are used as their direct source of medicine. Because plants have what's called totipotency, the ability to grow from cells in the plants, because seeds, properly understood, can be stored, and because they can be grown, although the seeds being stored in seed banks offer a much more robust way of preserving their genetic diversity, which is going to be clearly important if we're going to go anywhere with them in the future. We do have the opportunity of saving most of the plants, but as I said before, when you put in oil palm plantations in Indonesia, probably 19 out of 20 of the organisms there, and probably 25% of the plants there have never been cataloged, are completely unknown, and they're going in the dump right there. So lots more effort is needed. The field in plants is more favorable, but all those organisms are important for the recycling of energy, for recycling of materials, of chemicals, and so forth. And we need to preserve a much more robust ecosystem if we want to live.
So that's good.
Thank you. Peter, can you explain the term background rate of extinction, and how far back do you go to make the claim that it's about 1,000 times the background rate?
The background rate is about 1/10 per million per year, and the current rate, which can be measured both by the rising rate, see, it rises very markedly after the invention of printed material 500 years ago. 500 years ago, the population of the world was about 500 million people. About 120 million each in China and India, and a much smaller number in England, which makes people wonder why the Industrial Revolution got going in Europe. But at any rate, as it's grown on from there, and we've had written accounts, we've seen it rising towards what we would estimate now by habitat destruction as 1,000 times the background rate, or about 100 per million per year. And we see no alternative to continued actions of global warming, to continued growth of the human population by 2.5 billion in the next 33 years, by continued rise in consumption unless something really turns around, by a lack of people in industrialized countries caring about poor people in non-industrialized countries to act on this. So we see it going up to maybe half during the remainder of the century. Depending on what we do, we could do a whole lot better. I want to mention one other thing. if I may.
We are getting a rather long list of colleagues who would like to speak. May I collect some of these? I presume some of
Yeah.
these are comments.
Yes.
But would you like to add what you...
Yes, I would
wanted
just say one thing. I'd like to add what it says in Matthew 25:40, which is, "And the king shall answer and say unto him, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me." And I hope we can all think about that, because really it's the lack of attention to poor people, to underprivileged people, to disadvantaged people in poor countries that is really blowing the whole thing wide open. Of course we're consuming too much, but unless we show the kind of care and compassion for people in other countries that will make it possible for them to do better, we get nowhere.
Yes. Great. Professor Fromkin.
Peter, thank you for a wonderful talk. Suppose we set ourselves the task of preparing the next generation to be ready to step up and meet the challenge of Genesis that you quoted, and to be good stewards of the natural world. We would face the challenge of urbanization, where more and more children grow up in nature-free environments. We would face the challenge of screen time, where children, rather than play outside, play with their screens. There's a growing estrangement from nature. Are there strategies you would recommend that we would use to reverse that trend? Green spaces in cities, nature-based schools, conservation policies? How do we reverse the danger?
Yeah, all of the above, and indeed we had an excellent lecture on the we built cities essentially in the same way that Antioch was built when St. Paul rode up to the gates of the city, 2,000 years ago, and we need to build them very much better. Shenzhen in China was built starting in about 1980 and has 40% green space. There's no reason we can't do a whole lot better, but we've got to really do modern cities. We have to do many, many things. We have to do modern cities. We have to do modern villages. We have to do sustainable agriculture. We had about 10 papers on this in our on various aspects of that. But many things need to be done. But for people to change their mind, I swear that I think they need a spiritual reason to change their mind. I don't think showing them any number, any list of things or reasons to do it will work, because we're all basically tied up with our day-to-day lives and extraordinarily selfish.
Peter, may I ask you to hold back for a moment, and we quickly listen to 2-3 sentences each of 3 more people, and then you have the final word.
I'll do my
Professor
best.
Liliefeld.
You mentioned these mass extinctions 65 million years ago, which was probably initiated by some meteorite impact. But some 55 million years ago, there was an extinction, and I don't know how big it
When?
was, 55 million years ago.
Yes.
This was climate-driven, because there
Yes.
was a pulse of probably
Yes.
methane or CO2.
Yes.
Is it known what the rate of extinction was that was...
Not very well. no.
Hold it, please.
Oh, excuse me.
Professor Maybach,
A week ago, Monday, I had the pleasure of being with
microphone.
Sorry?
Okay.
Yes, a week ago Monday, I had the pleasure of being with your good friend E.O. Wilson in Washington for the first ever celebration of Half-Earth Day. It was consequential, in my view, because of a principle of behavioral science. We've talked a lot about behavior change and the need for behavior change today. One of the important things to recognize is that for people to want to change their behavior, you need to give them a reason to do so. Pointing to a clear destination that is motivating to a large number of people is going to be our greatest hope. Half-Earth Day is a very nice example of pointing to a clear destination.
Okay. There was an intervention, very brief.
You asked Peter the question about botanical gardens. What he did not share with you is just within the last 6 months, we have had major devastation of botanical gardens throughout the United States because of climate change-induced storms and fires. Hurricane Harvey flooded Mercer Botanical Garden completely. 100% underwater, and destroyed 2 other gardens along the Texas coast. Hurricane Irma wiped out another half a dozen botanical gardens in coastal Florida, and by some miracle, the Quarry Hill Botanical Gardens, which is in Glen Ellen, California, you're all familiar with the Sonoma fires, was surrounded on all 4 sides by the Tubbs Fire and amazingly did not burn. But we have not had climate change in our planning models for public gardens, and this is a new and urgent crisis for us.
Thank you for this information. Professor Haynes.
Well, thank you for a great talk. I mean, my question really is following up on Howie's and seeking really for potential solutions. And there are 2 areas I want to ask you about. First of all, it seems to me that the value systems of many indigenous communities are very much more in tune with planetary boundaries and nature's limits because they experience them every day. So are there examples, as far as you know, of linking sort of scientific, cutting-edge science with the values of indigenous communities and trying to work together to create kind of case studies of how we can protect nature, at the same time securing human health? And I also wonder whether there are some enlightened governments around the world that are thinking in this way. And maybe, again, we can draw on some of the experience of those governments in building up policies that link nature and sustainability and human health.
Thank you. Peter, you're summing up.
Yes, there are, but a lot of those are based on very low populations, and the more we change, the faster the populations grow, and people have not shown very much kindness or reserve in dealing with indigenous populations generally. It comes and go, and gradually they get wiped out. We can just look at the example in the United States to understand that. Wiping out basically the whole indigenous population for all practical purposes. And we're not that much better now, but yes, there are things to be learned, and some people are trying to do it. On the second and third, I've forgotten what they are, but I agree with both of them. It's what senility does to you.
Okay.
What was the first? Remind me. What was your question? Yeah.
Actually, can we learn something from this climate change-driven extinction 55 million years ago in terms of a proxy, what climate change is doing to biodiversity now or in the near future?
Yes, we can, but species are becoming very extinct largely because of human beings using up more of the real estate, cutting the forests, spreading agriculture, which is already on almost all the cultivated things, and actually climate change is coming in as a later entry in it, and is not going to be the major factor driving it, although it's going to be an important factor. And if it should get up to 5 or 6 degrees, we're toast, as they would say.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, did you want to come in? Did we, just briefly?
Yeah, I wanted to come in on the policy questions, the what to do. Mm-hmm. Because again, I feel that we need to be very targeted and focused because the time is so short. And I also want to emphasize again that our biggest obstacles are not the broad public, but the specific sectors that are strongly intervening and the specific sectors that need to be stopped at certain boundary points. And I was just looking, if I could, just, I won't take too much time, but at a recent Pew survey of public opinion around the world on climate. For most countries, even for the US, on the question, is climate change a major threat to your country? 56% in the US. In most countries, 70, 80%. What you see very clearly is that in countries where there's a big oil, gas, or coal industry, the number is lower. This is politics that we're facing. So on the climate change, we're really facing the politics of fossil fuels. We're not facing a generic lack of concern because people are experiencing the climate change anyway. But we're facing two fundamental problems always. That these problems are unique to our time because no one grappled with them before. So there are major, major technical problems to solve. And then there are political economy problems to solve. That is resistance or those who have to be stopped from the activities that they're doing. And the point I want to make is that on the loss of biosphere, which is dramatic, as Peter has said, this is largely agriculture, and it's largely large-scale agriculture in several places, and where it's small-scale agriculture, it's about poverty. And so one needs to focus specifically on these boundaries, drawing lines, and then understanding what is the technical and the political economy solution. The point I'm making is that, of course, public awareness is vital, but we can't expect the public to become ecologists, engineers, agronomists, and so on. What we need is the specialists saying this is what needs to be done. We need the opposition to be confronted in a very straightforward way. And of course, alongside that, we need as much broad public understanding and motivation as possible. But what we're not waiting for in general is an epiphany of a revolution in understanding, which we would love, but we'll not have a biosphere by the time we get that. We will have 5 degrees C by the time we get that. So we want to try that, and that's part of our motivation for being here. But there's very direct ways that are hugely important that I think we can intervene. And in climate and agriculture are the fundamental drivers of the land use crisis that Peter is so rightly and wisely despising. And of course, you have led on this also. And so focused answers can get us a long way, I believe.
Thank you, that was helpful.
I don't have 20 minutes to answer the many points there that I disagree with, so
we need to move on to our next paper. Thank you, Jeff, for bringing this up. We will have agriculture on the agenda tomorrow morning again, and need to start connecting the dots in those sessions back to biodiversity. Certainly we need to get out of these homogeneous fields which are deathly to lots of species which we have gotten out of existence due to so-called modern large-scale agriculture. Professor Ulrich Pöschel from Max Planck Institute will talk about air pollution, oxidative stress, and public health in the Anthropocene. You have the floor and our fullest attention.